Dr. Giordano. It is wonderful to have you here today. Thank you for joining us on the NatDev podcast show. And I would like to begin and ask you a couple of questions. First, if you could share a little bit about yourself, and then if you can share a little bit about what disruptive technologies are. So what is it that considers them or makes them considered disruptive?
Sure. So I'm Dr. James Giordano. I retired as Professor Emeritus of Neurology, Biochemistry, and Ethics from Georgetown University Medical Center, where I've been for 20 years. By training, I'm a neuroscientist, trained as a neurotoxicologist, neuropathologist, with also an emphasis on cognitive neurosciences. But I was also retrained in the area of science and philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of science, the political philosophy of science and technology, relevant to global ethics, with an emphasis there on how those technologies are integrative. So looking at science and technology as an intricate dance where science in some cases establishes the technology in some cases enables the science, and they both work together on a larger sort of political stage. And how does that then affect philosophy? So my career has been wonderful. It's been a 40-year career not only in the brain sciences, but how science and technology are leveraged and applied across the global stage, most notably for those domains of national security, intelligence, and defense. What I'm probably most well known for is my work in neuroweaponology, how the brain sciences could be used not only to affect others in the traditional sense of a weapon, in other words, means as contending against others, but also how we can increasingly use the brain sciences to optimize human health, operational protection, and enable the warfighter and intelligence operator to be safer, more viable, and obviously do their job in ways that are mission effective and efficient.
That is very impressive. And we'll just stop there.
It's great fun. I mean, it's been a wonderful career, and I'm privileged and honored to be here at NDU because after having spent about 7 years in uniform, got out in '95, I served with the United States Navy and Marine Corps as an aerospace physiologist. And the work that I did when I was in uniform had a lot to do with human factors, electronic warfare, biowarfare, aviation survival. After I'd gotten out, I continued my work with the Pentagon. I was a senior advisor for the Joint Staff, was also with the Naval War College, was with the Naval Academy for a number of years, while having a professorship at Georgetown. So coming to NDU, for me, has been sort of the fruition of my career, to sort of come back in many ways, not only to where it all started, but to really then serve the Joint Staff more directly in those ways, with the cutting edge of what science and tech do. So it's been a wonderful opportunity for me.
Absolutely. So you're a scholar practitioner in every sense.
Oh, that's a nice compliment. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I want to talk about your technology focus areas. And so among the center's focus areas, AI, cyber systems, biotech, quantum, and nano engineering, which do you see as the most disruptive to current warfighting paradigms? I want to jump right in here.
It's a great question. So let me back it up just a little bit, because I think that the nomenclature of a disruptive technology or these disruptive technologies as part of a suite, I think that that's important to define, because one would think axiomatically that there's something almost destructive about a disruptive technology. And so it takes on the connotation that these are weaponized. Not necessarily. What's being disrupted by these technologies is the status quo. So these really represent emerging technologies under the newest NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. These are referred to as critical technological areas. So these technologies aren't and should not be seen as siloed or working individually, but are rather more part of a larger assemblage, as I had mentioned earlier, a suite of technologies that can be used convergently in a larger paradigmatic approach. So the disruptive effect is certainly to the status quo, but then when that status quo is circumstantially or situationally applied to national security, intelligence, and defense, we then have to take a look at what that status is. How do we view stability, security? How do we view the capabilities of maintaining not only the homeland, but our international presence with regard to global power competition? And that's the status quo that is being impugned upon, threatened, and changed by these technologies. So you mentioned that there are, in fact, many: AI, cyber, which includes data, biotechnology, quantum, and autonomous systems, or at least unmanned systems. Again, here, the way to think about this is think about them as fingers on a hand. Right? So certainly, if I were, let's say, a musician, and I were going to play the score of contemporary national security, I might want to leverage each one of these to play a particular note. But the way I get a real symphonic effect is to play these in some more organized harmonic engagement. Not necessarily all at the same time, but in a way that's going to be coordinated, but it's going to be unified, but that's also going to be collaborative. So how do we take, for example, let's start with the human person. How do we take the biological sciences that would be so focal to the human element of the joint warfighter or the joint intelligence operator? And what do we do with that? What kind of new drugs, bugs, toxins could in fact be leveraged through the use of developing technologies, assessment technologies or intervention technologies, to be able to gain insight to various weaknesses or fortitudes, to be able to then purloin or at very, very least exploit the weaknesses of a competitor and adversary, or to fortify those capabilities of your own troops so as to be able to be more resistant, more resilient, more recuperative, and certainly more effective in whatever is going to be their military or intelligence occupations, correct? But if we look at the biotechnologies in their current situation, their iteration, are almost impossible to leverage with the capacity and power without big data. We need big data. Ergo, cyber, all the big data tools, all those techniques and technologies, big data as a field is impossible to render practically without some form of machine learning. Machine learning leads us into decision technologies, which then ultimately leads us into soft and then hard AI. So we need big data and AI to do bioscience and biotechnologies. Further, what we're learning about biology, particularly neurobiology and cognitive biology, can then be uptaken into what's called neuromimetic designs for architectures of AI that make them ever more autonomous, ever more agentic, and perhaps moving their computational capacities towards something that is more like cognition. Now we have to consider AI as not just a potential tool, but perhaps an actor or an agent within the combined battle space, interacting with these biological assets that are human. So now we see bio, data, cyber, and AI dimensionally and dynamically interacting. Let's go one step further. Now we take the ability to utilize the quantum realm, which is really, in some ways, to paraphrase Einstein, spooky stuff at a distance. The quantum realm exists at a very, very small scale and involves physical properties that are distinct from the mechanical realm that allows, number one, quantum computing to be exceedingly fast, very capable, very compartmentalized, but it's nascent, it's early. But we're moving quickly in those directions, and we're certainly aware of what our peer competitors are doing in that space. But we can also then use quantum-type systems that utilize quantum principles of physics that are somewhat unique, even when translated at least to the mechanical scale, for new age sensors, new age transmitters that have increased speed, increased fidelity, increased granularity. Now we take quantum, we put quantum into AI, and you have quantum computing and quantum AI. You marry the quantum properties with the properties of neuromimesis in AI, and you now have quantum bio-AI, biomimetic AI. We now understand how rapidly we can sense and transmit, so now we take quantum-type sensors and transmitters, and we use those to sense and transmit information to biological systems, like humans. So now what we see is this true integrative technological convergence. But more than that, we can also utilize quantum sensing and quantum transmitting in humans to be able to target what may be quantum-like processes within human systems to be able to affect human systems either positively or negatively, sometimes at a distance. And again, that's very, very incipient and early on. That domain of the quantum threat is not something that is apparent and close hand. But we have to appreciate the possibility. And then, of course, we can say, if we're not doing things that are close hand, what can we do at a distance? And one way to do things at a distance is to use remote systems. Increasingly, those remote systems take the form of unmanned systems, aerial, terrestrial, marine, inclusive of submarine, and ever more space. So now we're looking at unmanned systems that are generated and operated remotely through data. Those data are then interfaced increasingly through AI. Those AI systems feed into unmanned systems to make them semi-autonomous and autonomous unmanned systems. So now we really see all of those fingers not only just playing individual notes that create a wonderful symphonic, a suite of scientific and technological capability, They can all come together in unique ways and in unique combinations. So this is how we bring these disruptive technologies to the fore to appreciate what we can do in contemporary combat and battle spaces, but also what it portends for the near future and intermediate future of the warfare scenario on battlescapes of, let's say, warfare 2040 or warfare 2050.
And I was going to say, so these are technologies of high consequence. So in, I guess, layman's terms, how will they influence warfare?
Well, I think they influence warfare in a number of ways. I mean, warfare characteristically is axiomatically defined. Warfare is one group or collective of individuals waging some type of belligerent activity against another so as to render those individuals more susceptible to their ideals, their way, or to defend those things that they feel are right and good, kin and kith. So essentially, warfare is a power execution, a power execution that clearly has an aggressor and one that has targeting, and then ultimately the idea is to win. The law of armed conflict and just war principles would suggest that you don't enter a conflict unless you're able to at least come out with some measure of success. Nothing about the nature of that, the competitive, conflictive nature of that has changed. But what's changing as a consequence of these disruptive technologies is the reach, the granularity, the precision and specificity, which are not the same. Precision and specificity are sort of two interactive variables that allow granularity at a much more fidelitous level. And then you also see that something of the character changes. And particularly you're seeing a characterological change in the domain of what's now being called cognitive warfare, which is not just psychological warfare on steroids. It really takes on more than that. It appreciates the biological, psychological, and social multidimensionality of the human person as the agent and actor and executor of warfare and all the things that plan it, strategically, politically, by virtue of policy, and then targets those on a variety of interactive levels, certainly psychologically through narratives, memes, semiotics, but also directly biologically on the neurological system, and ever more socially, because the scale we have to now influence social environments politically, economically, is part of a larger global power balance that is economic and ecologic. So we see these multidimensionalities coming to the fore that are affecting the character of warfare, the speed of warfare, the precision of warfare. And when taken together, this then creates something of a juggernaut effect where the actual characterological dimensions of warfare that are multifold, I mean, not a single character, are changed. In other words, it's not necessarily as if its temperament has changed, but its character has. Its personality has changed in its specificity, in its speed, in its reach, and ultimately, I think, in its costs.
If we can go back to this convergence that you mentioned earlier, I like this idea of the hand for the symphony. Maybe if you can talk about the actual center itself and how, like, I guess, the practical efforts or the tasks, if you will, you all are taking to approach this convergence.
Well, I mean, if we go back to the fingers on the hand analogy, I mean, it's an analogy that works real well. Here, too, I think we can consider that my center is one of those particular fingers on a larger hand that exists essentially as the end of this appendage, this large arm, the long arm of NDU reaching out in terms of its other colleges. For example, Moore College and College of Information and Cyber Sciences. And this is part of an institute at the NDU, which is the Institute for National Strategic Studies, the INSS. And as the name would imply, it is just that. It takes a look at not only our own nation, how that nation sits, positions, moves, executes, engages strategically, tactical movements towards larger scale strategic goals on the global 21st century stage, but all of the domains and dimensions that go into effective polyglot and polyfocal strategy, and what strategic balance means. So my center sits as part of a number of other centers. For example, our China Center that deals not just with China per se, but China's hegemonic and leverageable influence in the Indo-Pac theater. We also have domestic threats, homeland threats. We have a center that deals with space, and we have a center that deals with strategic deterrence and studies of weapons of mass destruction. But here too, although these centers are operating perhaps within their own range of foci and locus and engagement, they work cooperatively as part of this larger unit, focused directly upon what it means in terms of national strategic studies and how those studies then contribute to our national strategic strategies, policies, executions. So they really are part of a larger whole.
What would you then say is the biggest challenge then in preparing the joint fighter for future conflict environments shaped by these disruptive technologies?
Oh, the biggest challenge.
The biggest or top three, maybe?
Well, yeah, it's a good question because I think, number one, it's a fluid question that changes as a consequence of the postures on the world stage. I mean, clearly, we have initiatives and agendas that are uniquely our own in terms of what we want our joint warfighter to be, given the nature of joint warfighting. But to paraphrase Sun Tzu, I think that the good warfighter is just as aware of what their competitors and adversaries are doing, so as to be able to inform what it is that they do, preparatively and in readiness. So one of the challenges is to maintain ongoing active surveillance discourse and a dialectical approach to what our peer competitors, cum potential adversaries, are doing on the global stage, both directly within their national strategies, agendas, and executions, but increasingly utilizing proxies, state proxies, and ever more non-state proxies. So this takes in a broader aperture, not only to look at statecraft, but also to look, for example, at terrorism, to look at the bioeconomies and global economies that affect various power balances on a variety of different levels. And then to posture appropriately in those ways that allow us to mobilize each and all of these domains, and not just the disruptive technologies, but our insights to the Indo-Pac theater, the homeland, the European theater, space, etc. And how they then comport with and align with the postures of our competitors and adversaries. The challenge, very often, is how do we fight for right and freedom, and at the same time keep our honor clean, recognizing that perhaps the philosophies and some of the ethics that then dictate research, development, and even practice in military intelligence applications of our adversaries may differ, and differ in ways that allow them to be somewhat more permissive, perhaps more promiscuous in what it is they can actually do on the global stage. And then how do we maintain our probity with regard to the laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, and just war?
I want to shift a little bit to mission and strategic direction, if that's okay. You all have a daunting task, given the the pace of development. So I want to talk about, or ask you, if it's okay, how you prioritize your research on disruptive technologies. What to study, given that rapid pace and innovation across the domains that you mentioned earlier.
Most explicitly, the direction, the focus, and the pacing of emphasis on particular technologies are dictated by the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Authorization Act. I mean, these are brand new. And crucially, in both of those documents, they mention critical technological areas. And those critical technological areas define for us what those foci are going to be. Now, they're well aligned. I mean, some of the foresight that we had going in terms of our ongoing discourse with the Joint Staff and beyond, would suggest that there are key areas that have a particular trajectory of technological readiness, development, engagement, not only here within the United States in terms of what's necessary for our military and joint fighter, but also what's going on, to reiterate, on the global stage, primarily among peer competitors. And in this particular case, our National Security Strategy and the National Defense Authorization Act have isolated, have identified those areas, AI, quantum, biotechnology, autonomous systems, as we'd mentioned before. So our alignment and the alignment with both of those documents was both preemptive in terms of our ongoing discourse, which by its nature is ultimately iterative. What are they interested in? What are we focusing on? And then are concretized by these documents that then reflect our tasking directly from the Joint Staff and combatant commands. But the next question is, what represents those things that are in those vistas of capability over the next 5 to 15 years? This becomes difficult. So one of the things we have to do is to engage in the appropriate level of forecasting and modeling. And that's a practical exercise with very specific methods. The logos of those methods, its literal methodology, is something that we work to adapt and we work to maintain flexible, utilizing those techniques and technologies that are available. In this case, not only are we studying AI, But AI can be a very, very useful tool, particularly in developing models that can then be gamed, tabletop exercises and war games, etc. So one of the things that we're looking to do is say, what do we have right now? In other words, what is on the available plate? And this brings us squarely to examine those technologies that exist within the current opportunity space at a very high technological readiness level, a TRL that is fairly high. In other words, these are ready for prime time. But then we also have to take a look at what types of things are on the proverbial research bench or engineering bench that are going to be ready for the battlefield within 5 years, 60 calendar months. That's not an arbitrary figure, for example. So we use the 5-year window because that's also the opportunistic space that DARPA uses, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And that's a very optimistic space to go from a concept to a working construct, from an idea to a usable instrument. But what's interesting is that span, that time course, is also changing as a consequence of what our peer competitors are doing. So for example, our Trans-Pacific peer competitor has an agency very similar to DARPA that has compressed that time span, their actualization framework, to about 40 calendar months. At face value to the uninitiated, that would seem 20 calendar months, what's that? Less than 2 years. That's not a huge difference. It is. Because bringing something to the fore, literally bringing something to missional readiness, where it is operationalizable in the field, in 20 months, given the sophistication and capabilities of these technologies, then affords a peer competitor adversary significant temporal advantage, spatial advantage, and obviously leverage. Leverage in the tactical space and leverage to then achieve strategic goals. So we see that 5-year window as the thing that is most proximate. That's what we're looking at right now. But we also have to be somewhat more farsighted. We can't be myopic. So part of that also involves our work, our literal engagement in doing the necessary surveillances, survey, forecasting, speculating, and a bit of futurism that goes along with the next 2 opportunity spaces. If the time from the past 5 years to the next 5 years can be considered the zone of probability, those things that have a relatively high tech level that are going to bring them into operational readiness within the next 5 years, what types of things can then evolve from that? What types of things are evolutionary? In other words, if we bring to full probabilistic readiness these tools, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, what types of things then become possible once we realize the probabilities of Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, which then prompts us to identify and define what those probabilities are. So how do we go from Alpha, Bravo, Charlie to Delta, Echo, Foxtrot? That's then that vista of possibility, 6 years to 10 years, 12 years. But we need to look beyond that. And the reason for that is that our principal Trans-Pac competitor does not necessarily work that way. They don't work from a now till then time frame. They work in a far more strategically latent orientation. What do they wish to achieve, for example, by the Sentinel year of 2049? On a number of domains. Technology in the battle space is one of them. So what types of things are they looking to realize in 2049, and what needs to occur between now and then to get to these points of viable realization, to bring these things to fruition? That's a slightly different paradigm of technological readiness leveling and appropriation, but it's one that we've become not only accustomed to examining by virtue of comparison, but also one of preparing for in terms of where our readiness is orientation. So it's a little bit more difficult to look at that period of time from 15 years to 20, 25 years in the future. That's that vista or that horizon of potentiality. In other words, having gone from realizing Alpha, Bravo, Charlie to then engaging the possibilities of Delta, Echo, Fox, what lies beyond Fox? What happens once we get to the crest of that hill? What potential is there? It becomes a little bit more difficult for us to speculate and forecast because now you have the possibilities of multidimensional, multiplex, fractal diffusion, different patterns of use. How do those patterns of use affect the social milieu, the biological milieu, the psychological and political and economic milieu? But these can all be tabletop exercised and gamed, and that's part of our approach, is looking at these 3 vistas, these 3 horizons, the probable, the possible, the potential, and what technologies can be generated, how those technologies affect those various environments, and how those environments may then dictate what technologies are then identified and realized. So that's the general working game plan. It's both tactically nimble and looks to be strategically sentinel.
Maybe we can bring it back to the the right now. Kind of recognizing the national security strategy, just kind of hit the streets in the last few months. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how your work aligns with some of the national security strategy objectives within that.
Well, it aligns directly because that's essentially the set of orders to which we march. I mean, it can't get any clearer than that. As you know, the National Defense University is the Joint Chiefs University. And the capabilization of that mission statement is translated down to each one of NDU's component parts and colleges. The INSS, as essentially the research arm of the NDU, is no different. So our research agenda broadly within the INSS that are then communicated down to the sub-programs and centers within the INSS directly reflect the needs, values, in some cases, the viabilities of key areas of interest that are of direct relevance to operational readiness for the Joint Staff. So for us, it really is just a question of following the marching orders and going along with that. So direct alignment with the current national strategic strategy or national security strategy, total accordance with the National Defense Authorization Act in terms of what types of things have been financially appropriated for and allocated, and then what is exactly in that language that would dictate not only the focus, but the tenor and the speed and the tempo at which various things are approached and studied in terms of where they fall out, prioritization given our national security strategy that really provides, if you will, the score to which we march.
And I want to shift a little bit now into ethics. How does the center assess the ethical implications then of emerging technologies such as bioenhancements or autonomous weapons?
The ethics are inseparable from the approach to the technology. Now, let me get a little academic. Let me put my old professor's hat back on. I'll stroke my beard and be a graybeard. I mean, if we actually look at the term technology, I think in the colloquial sense, we've come to take that term far more superficially than it should be taken. The nature of the tool, the thing itself, that's techne, that comes from an ancient Greek word, techne, which is not just the tool itself, but everything that went into making the tool and how the tool is then used. So it's not just a physical instrument. It's also all of the practices that go along with building the instrument, intentionalizing the instrument, and using it. That older concept of techne is sort of incorporated into the contemporary concept of technology. So really what we look at is the logos as well as the techne. The actual instruments themselves, AI, big data, all these different instrumentations for biological assessment and intervention, quantum science and its applications, various autonomous vehicles and independent vehicles. Well, those are the tools. What goes into making the tools? What is the intent? What are the diversity of uses? What are the rules, guidelines, and governances of those tools? How do those rules comport, for example, with the rules of armed conflict and rules of engagement? Augustinian principles of just war, not only justification for war, but just conduct in warfare, just conduct after warfare, and increasingly working what's sometimes referred to as left of boom, preparatively, preventatively, jus contra bellum, justification for use to prevent the escalation to warfare, which then gets us squarely, perhaps, into the pre-kinetic or non-kinetic zone that may also then entertain what things are done clandestinely or covertly. So it opens up an entire new domain, a whole new set of dimensions, and in some ways opens a Pandora's box. The Pandora's box being that these technologies, these tools, afford us great capability to do stuff, to work in the AI realm with ever more autonomous and agentic forms of informational processing, to harness, utilize, synthesize, and engage vast types of massive multidimensional, multi-level data, to engage the biological system on a variety of levels, from the subcellular all the way to the social, from the individual to the international, to work remotely with great capability through various vehicles that then engage high speed at quantum. But given what we can do, the question is, what should we do? Should we do the things we can? What things should we not do? How should we comport our activities in the research, development, translation, and use front, given the fact that we may be confronting peer competitors and adversaries who, to reiterate a point I made earlier, have different cultures, different needs, different values, different philosophies, different politics, and perhaps different ethics that may be more permissive to allow certain things to advance and be put into prime time than we do, and may also dictate the way they interpret laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, and permissibility for what they view to be their nationalistic agenda of what is right and good, protecting kin, kith, and ideology. So the ethics figures into it not necessarily as just guardrails to be able to say, don't do this, but certainly guidance rails and guidance metrics to say, this is what we can do, this is what we should do, this is what we must do to be able to remain not only apace of our peer competitors come adversaries, but ahead of our peer competitors and adversaries, not in a way that represents dominance, but in a way that represents nimbleness, flexibility, and capability for a vastly changing palette of scientific and technological tools and instruments leverageable across a wide range of capabilities and circumstances on the global stage.
I'm thinking then the core of that I took away, then it's not just what we can do, but it's also what we should do.
And then I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and I think if that's the prudential question, taking what is prudent and putting it into practice, if we look at prudence as practical wisdom, well, perhaps the prudential side, the most prudential side is that wisdom. We can do a lot of things. What should we do? What should we not do? But the actual practicality then becomes, can we do the things we should? What are those constraints? What are those permissivities? What are those latitudes? And then how do those things then feed into informing and developing doctrine, policy that are executable, that are governable, regulatable, perhaps attributable, and in some cases not only governable, but attributable if there are various violations. And this then speaks to our work engaging the ethical informing and scientific and technological informing of military doctrine here in the United States, and the way our military then postures militarily and politically in some ways, and I mean that by virtue of policy, not necessarily partisan politics, but with regard to international policies, guidelines, conventions, treaties, and laws that dictate and govern scientific and technological weaponry, conduct in this ever-changing milieu of what represents a new battlescape.
So with all this wealth of knowledge that your center possesses, how does the center engage with external stakeholders, such as industry, academia, and our allied partners?
Once again, it really is a direct dictate. Given that NDU is the Joint Chiefs University and that INS represents its principal research arm, we're very responsive and completely engaged with those needs that are dictated by the Joint Staff and by direction, by various combatant commands, and in some cases, subcommands. So in other words, those areas that represent the highest utility, the highest value, that need to be researched, need to be investigated, need to be explored with regard to their possibilities, probabilities, values, viabilities, and usabilities in real-world operations, well, that dictates where the needle goes. That needle represents our true north, if you will. We need to be flexible, we need to be capable, nimble, but I think we also need to bring to the fore that level of subject matter expertise, which then gets to another question. That question being the necessary capabilities that the INSS convenes, not only within my center, but across all of its centers and programs, which really is I think, the strong suit of the Institute for National Strategic Studies, is that it has multidisciplinary, multidimensional subject matter experts that can be pulled into specific projects as well as programs in a much more horizontalized orientation that builds upon that subject matter expertise for team assemblage. So once again, I mean, how do we engage? We engage by direction, we engage by request, we engage by sponsorship, and we engage by essentially employing, if you will, the subject matter expertise and experience that's constituent to the complement of the individuals who staff the INSS.
And if I can bring it down now to specifically the National Defense University, what opportunities are there for our faculty, for our student body?
We have an open door policy. We are part of the NDU, and as part of the NDU, that idea of the universum is exactly that. It's a universal collaboration. I have an open hand policy. My thought is anyone who's interested in what it is that I and my center do, not only alone, but in concert with the other programs and centers of the INSS, are certainly welcome to engage, to conjoin, to collaborate. I welcome that collaboration because realistically, that's where we get diversity of viewpoints, perspectives, and their strengths in that sort of hybrid vigor of ideas, right? So for our students, for our faculty, I have an open hand policy, an open door policy, and as you may know, we've revived our sort of weekly online journal or online informational sheet, which is called the Strategic Insights. And I invite participation of folks who'd like to write for Strategic Insights, either collaboratively or singularly, with key topics that are of focal interest to not only what they're doing, but to the larger community with regard to NDU, and much larger, Joint Staff in the military in the main.
So last question before we go here. Thank you again so much for your time. What kinds of things keep you up at night? I mean, you talked about some of the, very, in my mind, daunting, emerging technology. But what kinds of things, keep you up at night?
There's an old wives' tale that says that a good night's sleep makes your hair get thicker, and obviously I haven't had a good. I think what really gives me pause for both intellectual and practical concern, in other words, what I worry about. Three things, and again, not alone, not in isolation, but in synergy. I worry about biotech. I mean, not just because that's where my sandbox lies, probably because I'm most familiar with it. Like anything else, familiarity breeds both fear, contempt, and capability. But I'm seeing that the convergence of a variety of different areas of the biological sciences, I mean, de-siloing them in this convergent approach within bio, but also more broadly among the other natural sciences, physical sciences, and life sciences, opens up a much, much broader opportunity space to be able to do exciting things, provocative things, and in some cases, highly contentious things and things that are problematic. So for example, the fusion of AI with bioscience and biotech allows us to be far more analytic, far more informationally ubiquitous and capable. Synthetic biology, gene editing, what we're learning about the neural system, not as a system, but as systems interacting with systems. Each one of these things allows us increased capability to access biology, to access biology, and to affect biology. And affect is just a fancy way of saying target. Because once we're able to do that, we can then develop those tools and those techniques that allow for that targetability on a variety of levels. The biological level is one, but we talked about AI. That cooperativity, that conjoinment of AI and the biosciences opens a whole range of possibilities with trajectories that are both positively and negatively valent based upon perspective. The things that we can use to develop instruments, methods that can heal and help can also be used to burden and harm. And we've seen that. We've seen the use, for example, of AI generated towards developing novel combinations of chemicals and peptides towards therapeutic benefit that at the same time are cranking out algorithms and possibilities, permutations and combinations for potential biological and chemical weapons. The power is there. The reins are something that we hold. That fusion of science and technology is what worries me. I mean, look, I'm just one humble guy thinking what I'd like to think are important thoughts by direction of those who are seeing farther than I. I'm one person, I'm not alone. Our peer competitors and adversaries are thinking the same way. Proxy states, proxy individuals, and non-state actors are thinking the same way with the same level of intellect, and they're thinking what they're going to do is use these in ways that defend what they hold to be right and good, but perhaps with very, very different ethical principles. So what worries me is the capability that is being conferred by the great power of science and technology, and vice versa, the power that's being gained by the great capabilities of science and technology that is being diversified in a number of different hands, nationally, as well as with individuals. And I think what we're going to see is that's going to demand much greater level of rigor and stringency in our surveillance, in our oversight, our participation to be able to be ahead of the science and technological capabilities and how they may be translated, but also our contribution to policy and governance on the world stage.
Well, Dr. G, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you here
thank
for
you.
the NetDev podcast show. And I'll sleep better at night knowing that you
I'm glad.
are thinking of these things and have a center dedicated to this research. So,
Well, I can change my call sign to Salmonex.
Yeah.
That'll be all well and good. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure,
you
and
so
thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.